Pan Tadeusz by Adam Mickiewicz. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date. Chapter 5. The Brawl Argument. Telemena's plans for the chase. The little gardener is prepared for her entry into the great world and listens to the instructions of her guardian. The hunters return. Great amazement of Thaddeus. A second meeting in the Temple of Meditation and a reconciliation made easy by the mediation of ants. Conversation at table about the hunt. The seneschal's tale of Regtan and the Prince de Nassau interrupted. Preliminaries of peace between the two factions also interrupted. Apparition with a key, the brawl. The Count and Gerwazi hold a council of war. The seneschal, after honorably concluding his hunt, was returning from the wood, but Telemena in the depths of the deserted mansion was just beginning her hunting. To be sure, she sat without moving, with her arms folded on her breast, but with her thoughts she was pursuing two beasts. She was searching for means to invest and capture them both at once, the Count and Thaddeus. The Count was a young magnate, the heir of a great house, handsome and attractive, and already a trifle in love. Well, he might be fickle. Then, was he sincerely in love? Would he consent to marry? Especially a woman some years older than he, and not rich? With these thoughts, Telemena rose from the sofa and stood on tiptoe. You would have said that she had grown tall. She opened slightly her gown over her bosom, leaned sideways, surveyed herself with a diligent eye, and again asked counsel of her mirror. A moment later, she lowered her eyes, sighed, and sat down. The Count was a grandee. Men of property are changeable in their tastes. The Count was a blonde. Blondes are not over-passionate. But Thaddeus, a simple lad, an honest boy, almost a child. He was beginning to fall in love for the first time. If well looked to, he would not easily break his first ties. Besides that, he was already under obligations to Telemena. While they are young, though men are fickle in their thoughts, they are more constant in their feelings than their grandfathers, because they have a conscience. The simple and maiden-like heart of a youth long preserves gratitude for the first sweets of love. It welcomes enjoyment and bids it farewell with gaiety, like a modest meal, which we share with a friend. Only an old drunkard, whose inwards are already burning, loathes the drink in which he drowns himself. All this Telemena knew thoroughly, for she had both sense and large experience. But what would people say? One could withdraw from their sight, go to another locality, live in retirement, or, what was better, remove entirely from the vicinity, for instance, make a little trip to the capital. She might introduce the young lad to the great world, guide his steps, aid him, counsel him, form his heart, have in him a counselor and brother. Finally, she might enjoy the world herself, while her years permitted. With these thoughts she walked boldly and gaily several times up and down the chamber. Again she lowered her brow. It might be well also to think about the fate of the Count. Could she not manage to interest him in Zozia? She was not rich, but of equal birth to his, of a senatorial family, the daughter of a dignitary. If their marriage should come to pass, Telemena would have a refuge for the future in their home, being kin to Zozia and the one who secured her for the Count. She would be like a mother for the young couple. After this decisive consultation, held with herself, she called from the window to Zozia, who was playing in the garden. Zozia was standing bareheaded in her morning gown, holding a sieve aloft in her hands. The barnyard fowls were running to her feet. From one side, the rough feathered hens came rolling like balls of yarn. From the other, the crested cocks, shaking the coral helms upon their heads and oaring themselves with their wings over the furrows and through the bushes, stretched out broadly their spurred feet. Behind them slowly advanced a puffed-up turkey-cock, fretting at the complaints of his garrulous spouse. There the peacocks, like rafts, steered themselves over the meadow with their long tails, and here and there a silver-winged dove would fall from on high like a tassel of snow. In the middle of the circle of greensward extended a noisy moving circle of birds, girt round with a belt of doves, like a white ribbon, mottled with stars, spots, and stripes. Here amber beaks and there coral crests rose from the thick mass of feathers like fish from the waves. Their necks were thrust forward and with soft movements continually wavered to and fro like water lilies. 1,000 eyes like stars glittered upon Zozia. In the center, raised high above the birds, white herself, and dressed in a long white gown, She turned about like a fountain playing amid flowers. She took from the sieve and scattered over the wings and heads, with a hand white as pearls, a dense pearly hail of barley grains. It was grain worthy of a lord's table, and was made for thickening the Lithuanian broths. By stealing it from the pantry cupboard for her poultry, Zosia did damage to the housekeeping. She heard the call, "Zosia." That was her aunt's voice. She sprinkled out all at once to the birds the remnant of the dainties, and twirling the sieve as a dancer a tambourine and beating it rhythmically, the playful maiden began to skip over the peacocks, the doves, and the hens. The birds, disturbed, fluttered up in a throng. Zosia, hardly touching the ground with her feet, seemed to tower high above them. Before her the white doves, which she startled in her course, flew as before the chariot of the goddess of love. Zosia with a shout rushed through the window into the chamber, and out of breath sat down upon her aunt's lap. Telemina, kissing her and stroking her under the chin, with joy observed the liveliness and charm of the child, for she really loved her ward. But once more she made a solemn face, rose, and walking up and down and across the chamber, and holding her finger on her lips, she spoke thus: "My dear Zosia, you are quite forgetful both of your age and of your station in life. Why, today you are beginning your 14th year. It is time to give up turkeys and hens. Fie! Is such fun worthy of a dignitary's daughter? And you have petted long enough those sunburned peasants' children, Zosia. My heart aches to look at you. You have tanned your shoulders dreadfully, like a real little gypsy, and you walk and move like a village girl. From now on I shall see that all this is changed. I shall begin today. Today I shall take you into society, to the drawing-room, to our guests. We have a throng of guests here. See that you do not cause me shame." Zosia jumped from her place and clapped her hands, and clasping both arms around her aunt's neck, she wept and laughed by turns for very joy. "Oh, auntie, it is so long since I have seen any guests. Since I have been living here with the hens and turkeys, the only guest that I have seen was a wild dove. I'm just a little tired of sitting in the chamber. The judge even says that it is bad for the health." "The judge," interrupted her aunt, "has continually been bothering me with requests to take you out into society, has continually been mumbling under his breath that you are already grown up. He doesn't know what he is talking about himself. He is an old fellow who never had any experience in the great world. I know better how much preparation a young lady needs in order to make an impression when she comes out in society. You see, Zosia, that anyone who grows up in the sight of men, even though she may be beautiful and clever, produces no impression, since all have been accustomed to seeing her ever since she was small. But if a well-trained, grown-up young lady suddenly appears glittering before the world from no one knows where, then everybody crowds up to her out of curiosity, observes all her movements, each glance of her eye, attends to her words and repeats them to others. And when a young person gets to be in fashion, everyone must praise her, even if he does not like her. I hope that you know how to behave. You grew up in the capital. Though you have been living 2 years hereabouts, you have not yet completely forgotten St. Petersburg. Well, Zosia, make your toilet. Get the things from my desk. You will find ready everything needed for dressing. Hurry up, for at any minute they may come home from hunting." The chambermaid and a serving girl were summoned. Into a silver basin they poured a pitcher of water, and Zosia, fluttering like a sparrow in the sand, washed with the aid of the servant her hands, face, and neck. Telemina opened her St. Petersburg stores and took forth bottles of perfumes and jars of pomade. She sprinkled Zosia over with choice perfume, the fragrance filled the room, and smeared her hair with ointment. Zosia put on white open-work stockings and white satin shoes from Warsaw. Meanwhile the chambermaid had laced her up and then thrown a dressing-sack over the young lady's shoulders. After crimping her hair with a hot iron, they proceeded to take off the curl-papers. Her locks, since they were rather short, they made into 2 braids, leaving the hair smooth on the brow and temples. Then the chambermaid, weaving into a wreath some freshly gathered cornflowers, gave them to Telemina, who pinned them skillfully on Zosia's head from the right to the left. The flowers were relieved very beautifully against the light hair, as against ears of grain. They took off the dressing-sack. The toilet was complete. Zosia threw over her head a white gown and rolled up a little white handkerchief in her hand, and thus, all in white, she looked like a white lily herself. After adjusting once more both her hair and her apparel, they told her to walk the length and breadth of the room. Telemina observed her with the eyes of an expert. She drilled her niece, grew angry and grimaced. Finally, at Zosia's curtsy, she cried out in despair, "Unhappy me, Zosia! You see what comes of living among geese and shepherds. You stride along like a boy and turn your eyes to the right and left like a divorced woman. Curtsy! See how awkward you are." "Oh, auntie," said Zosia sadly, "how am I to blame? You have locked me up, auntie. There was nobody to dance with. To pass the time away, I like to feed the birds and to pet the children. But just wait, auntie, till I've lived among other people for a little while. You'll see how I improve." "Well, of the two evils," said her aunt, "it was better to stay with the birds than with such a rabble as have hitherto been our guests. Just recollect who have been our visitors here. The parish priest, who mumbled a prayer or played checkers, and the lawyers with their tobacco pipes. They are noble cavaliers. You would have learned fine manners from them. Now, at all events, there is someone to show yourself to. We have a well-bred company in the house. Note well, Zosia, we have here a young count, a gentleman, well-educated, a relative of the Wojewada. See that you are polite to him." The neighing of horses is heard and the chatter of the hunters. They are at the gate. Here they are. Taking Zosia on her arm, she ran to the reception room. None of the sportsmen had as yet come in. They had to change their clothes in the chambers, as they did not wish to join the ladies in their hunting coats. The first to enter were the young men, Thaddeus and the Count, who had dressed in great haste. Telemena discharged the duties of hostess, greeted those who entered, offered them seats, and entertained them with conversation. She presented her niece to each in turn, first of all to Thaddeus, as being his near relative. Zosia curtsied politely. He bowed low, wanted to say something to her, and had already opened his lips. But when he looked into Zosia's eyes, he was so abashed that, standing dumb before her, he first flushed and then grew pale. What lay upon his heart he himself could not guess. He felt himself very unhappy. He had recognized Zosia by her stature and her bright hair and her voice. That form and that little head he had seen as she stood upon the fence, that charming voice had aroused him today for the hunt. The seneschal extricated Thaddeus from his confusion. Seeing that he was growing pale and that he was tottering on his legs, he advised him to go to his room and rest. Thaddeus took his stand in the corner and leaned on the mantel, without saying a word. His wide-open, wandering eyes he turned now on the aunt and now on the niece. Telemena perceived that his first sight of Zosia had made a great impression on him. She did not guess all, but she seemed rather distracted as she entertained the guests, and did not take her eyes from the young man. Finally, watching her chance, she ran up to him. "Are you well? Why are you so gloomy?" she asked him. She pressed her questions, she hinted about Zosia, and began to jest with him. Thaddeus was unmoved. Leaning on his elbow, he kept silent, frowned, and puckered his lips. So much the more did he confuse and amaze Telemena. Suddenly she changed her countenance and the tone of her discourse. She arose in wrath, and with sharp words began to shower on him sarcasms and reproaches. Thaddeus, too, started up, as if stung by a wasp. He looked askance. Without saying a word, he spat, kicked away his chair, and bolted from the room, slamming the door behind him. Luckily, no one of the guests paid attention to this scene, except Telemena. Flying out through the gate, he ran straight into the field. As a pike, when a fisherman's spear pierces through its breast, plunges and dives, thinking to escape, but everywhere drags with it the iron and the line. So Thaddeus bore with him his troubles, as he plowed through the ditches and vaulted the fences, without aim or path, until, after wandering for no small time, he finally entered the depths of the wood, and, whether on purpose or by chance, happened on the little hill which was the witness of his yesterday's happiness, and where he had received that note, the earnest of love, a place, as we know, called the Temple of Meditation. When he glanced about, behold, there she was. It was Telemena, solitary, buried in thought, and changed in pose and costume from her of yesterday. Dressed all in white, seated upon a stone, and motionless as if herself carved of stone, she had buried her face in her open hands. Though you could not hear her sobs, you felt that she was dissolved in tears. In vain did the heart of Thaddeus defend itself. He took pity. He felt that compassion moved him. He long gazed without speaking, hidden behind a tree. At last he sighed and said to himself angrily, "Stupid! How is she to blame if I deceived myself?" So he slowly thrust out his head towards her from behind the tree. But suddenly Telemina tore herself from her seat, threw herself to the right and the left, and jumped across the stream. With outstretched arms and disheveled hair, all pale, she rushed for the wood, leapt into the air, knelt, and fell down, and, not being able to get up again, she writhed on the turf. One could see by her motions from what dreadful torture she was suffering. She seized herself by the breast, the neck, the soles of her feet, her knees. Thaddeus sprang towards her, thinking that she had gone mad or was having an epileptic fit, but these movements proceeded from a different cause. By a neighboring birch tree was a great ant-hill. The frugal insects were wont to crawl around over the grass, mobile and black. Whether from necessity or from pleasure one cannot tell, they were especially fond of visiting the temple of meditation. From the hillock, their capital, to the shores of the spring they had trodden a path, by which they led their troops. Unfortunately, Telemina was sitting in the middle of the pathway. The ants, allured by the sheen of the snow-white stocking, crawled up on it, and in swarms began to tickle and bite. Telemina was forced to run away and shake herself, finally to sit down on the grass and catch the insects. Thaddeus could not refuse her his aid. Brushing her gown, he bent down to her feet. By chance, he approached his lips to Telemina's temples. In so tender a posture, though they said nothing of their recent quarrels, nevertheless they were reconciled, and there is no telling how long their discourse would have lasted, had not the bell from Soplicoa aroused them. It was the signal for supper. It was time to return home, especially since in the distance the crackling of broken branches could be heard. Perhaps they were looking for them? To return together was not fitting, so Telemina stole to the right towards the garden, and Thaddeus ran to the left, to the highway. On this detour both were somewhat disturbed. It seemed to Telemina that once from behind a bush shone the thin, cowled face of Roback. Thaddeus saw distinctly that once or twice a long white phantom made its appearance on his left. What it was he knew not, but he had a suspicion that it was the Count in his long English frock-coat. They had supper in the old castle. The obstinate protégé, not heeding the definite orders of the judge, had again stormed the castle in the absence of the people of higher station, and, as he said, had foreclosed the mortgage on it. The guests entered in order and stood about the table. The chamberlain took his place at the head. This honor befitted him from his age and his office. Advancing to it, he bowed to the ladies, the old men, and the young men. The collector of alms was not at the table. The chamberlain's wife occupied the place of the Bernardine, on her husband's right. The judge, when he had stationed the guests as was fitting, pronounced a Latin grace. Brandy was passed to the gentlemen. Thereupon all sat down, and silently and with relish they ate the cold salad of beet leaves whitened with cream. After the cold dish came crabs, chickens, and asparagus, along with glasses of Malaga and of Hungarian wine. All ate, drank, and were silent. Probably never since the time when the walls of this castle were erected, which had generously entertained so many noble gentlemen, and had heard and echoed so many vivets, had there been memory of so gloomy a supper. The great, empty hall of the castle echoed only the popping of corks and the clink of plates. You would have said that some evil spirit had tied up the lips of the guests. Many were the causes of this silence. The sportsmen had returned from the forest talkative enough, but when their ardor had cooled, and they thought over the hunt, they realized that they had come out of it with no great glory. Was it necessary that a monkish cowl, bobbing up from God knows where, like Philip from the hemp, should give a lesson to all the huntsmen of the district? Oh, shame! What would they say of this in Osmiana and Lida, which for ages had been rivals of their own district for the supremacy in woodcrafts? So they were thinking this over. But the assessor and the notary, besides their mutual grudges, had on their minds the recent shame of their greyhounds. Before their eyes hovered a rascally hare, leaping nimbly about and bobbing its little tail from the wood's edge, in mockery of them. With this tale it beat upon their hearts as with a scourge, so they sat with faces bent over their plates. But the assessor had still more recent reasons for chagrin when he gazed at Telemena and at his rivals. Telemena was sitting half turned away from Thaddeus, and in her confusion hardly dared to glance at him. She wanted to amuse the gloomy count, and to make him talk more freely, so as to get him into better humor. For the count was strangely glum when he returned from his walk, or rather, as Thaddeus thought, from his ambuscade. While listening to Telemena, he raised his brow haughtily, frowned, and looked at her almost with contempt. Then he sat down as near Zozia as he could, filled her glass and passed plates to her, saying 1,000 polite things and bowing and smiling. Sometimes he rolled his eyes and sighed deeply. It was evident, however, despite such skillful deception, that he was flirting merely to spite Telemena, for every time that he turned his head away, apparently by accident, his threatening eye glittered upon Telemena. Telemena could not understand what all this meant. Shrugging her shoulders, she thought, "He's showing off!" After all, she was rather glad of the Count's new courtship, and turned her attention to her other neighbor. Thaddeus, also gloomy, ate nothing and drank nothing. He seemed to be listening to the conversation and glued his eyes on his plate. When Telemena poured him out wine, he was angry at her importunity. When she asked about his health, he yawned. He took it ill, so much had he changed in one evening, that Telemena was too ready to flirt. He was vexed that her gown was cut so low, immodestly, and now for the first time, when he raised his eyes, he was almost frightened. For his sight had quickened. Hardly had he glanced at Telemena's rosy face, when all at once he discovered a great and terrible secret. For heaven's sake, she was rouged. Whether the rouge was of a bad sort, or somehow had been accidentally scratched upon her face, at all events, here and there it was thin, and revealed beneath it a coarser complexion. Perhaps Thaddeus himself, in the temple of meditation, speaking too near her, had brushed from its white foundation the carmine, lighter than the dust of a butterfly's wing. Telemena had come back from the wood in too much of a hurry, and had not had time to repair her coloring. Around her mouth, in particular, freckles could be seen. So the eyes of Thaddeus, like cunning spies, having discovered one piece of treason, began to explore one after another her remaining charms, and everywhere discovered some falsity. 2 teeth were missing in her mouth. On her brow and temples there were wrinkles. Thousands of wrinkles were concealed beneath her chin. Alas, Thaddeus felt how unwise it is to observe too closely a beautiful object, how shameful to be a spy over one's sweetheart, how even loathsome it is to change one's taste and heart, but who can control his heart? In vain he tried to supply the lack of love by conscience, to warm again the coldness of his soul with the flame of her glance. Now that glance, like the moon, bright but without warmth, shone over the surface of a soul that was chilled to its depths. Making such complaints and reproaches to himself, he bent his head over his plate, kept silent, and bit his lips. Meanwhile an evil spirit assailed him with a new temptation, to listen to what Zozia was saying to the Count. The girl, captivated by the Count's affability, at first blushed, lowering her eyes. Then they began to laugh, and finally to talk about a certain unexpected meeting in the garden, about a certain stepping over the burdocks and the vegetable beds. Thaddeus, eagerly pricking up his ears, devoured the bitter words and digested them in his soul. He had a frightful meal. As a serpent in a garden drinks with its double tongue from poisonous herbs, then rolls into a ball and lies down upon the path, threatening the foot that may carelessly step upon it, so Thaddeus, filled with the poison of jealousy, seemed indifferent, but yet was bursting with malice. In the merriest assembly, if a few are out of sorts, at once their gloom spreads to the rest. The sportsmen had long ceased to speak, and now the other side of the table became silent, infected with the spleen of Thaddeus. Even the chamberlain was unusually gloomy and had no wish to chat, observing that his daughters, handsome and well-dowered young ladies as they were, in the flower of youth, by universal opinion the best matches in the district, were silent and neglected by the young men, who were also silent. This also caused concern to the hospitable judge, and the seneschal, noticing that all were thus silent, called the meal not a Polish but a wolf's supper. Horeszkos had an ear very sensitive to silence. He himself was a great talker, and he was inordinately fond of chatterers. It was no wonder. He had passed all his life with the gentry at banquets, hunts, assemblies, and district consultations. He was accustomed to having something always drumming in his ears, even when he himself was silent, or was stealing with a flapper after a fly, or sat musing with closed eyes. By day he sought conversation. By night they had to repeat to him the rosary prayers, or tell him stories. Hence also he was a staunch enemy of the tobacco pipe, which he thought invented by the Germans in order to denationalize us. He used to say, "To make Poland dumb is to Germanize Poland." The old man, who had prattled all through his life, now wished to repose amid prattle. Silence awoke him from sleep. Thus millers, lulled by the clatter of the wheels, as soon as the axles stop, awake crying in fright, "The Lord be with us." The seneschal by a bow made a sign to the chamberlain, and with his hand raised to his lips, motioned to the judge, asking for the floor. The gentlemen both returned that mute bow, meaning, "Pray speak." The seneschal opened his address. "I might venture to beg the young men to entertain us at this supper, according to the ancient custom, not to sit silent and munch. Are we Capuchin fathers? Whoever keeps silent among the gentry acts exactly like a hunter who lets his cartridge rust in his gun. Therefore I praise highly the garrulity of our ancestors." After the chase they went to the table not only to eat, but that they might together speak forth freely what each one had within his heart. The faults and merits of the huntsmen and the beaters, the hounds, the shots, all were included in the order of the day. There would arise a hubbub as dear to the ears of the sportsman as a second rousing of the beast. I know what ails you all. That cloud of black cares has undoubtedly arisen from Roback's cowl. You are ashamed of your bad shots. Let not your shame burn you. I have known better hunters than you, and they used to miss. To hit, to miss, to correct one's mistake, that is hunter's luck. I myself, though I have been carrying a gun ever since I was a child, have often missed. That famous sportsman Toloshchik used to miss, and even the late Pan Reitan did not always hit the mark. Of Reitan I will speak later. As for letting the beast escape from the line of beaters, as for the two young gentlemen's not holding their ground before the beast as they ought, though they had a pike in their hands, that no one can either praise or blame. For to retreat with one's gun loaded was, according to our old ideas, to be a coward of cowards. Likewise to shoot blindly, as many do, without letting the beast come close or sighting at it, is a shameful thing. But whoever aims well, whoever lets the beast come near him as is proper, even if he misses, may retire without shame, or he may fight with the pike, but at his own pleasure and not from compulsion, since the pike is put in a sportsman's hands, not for attack, but for defense alone. Such was the ancient custom, and so believe me, and do not take your retreat to heart, my beloved Thaddeus and your honor the Count. But whenever you call to mind the happenings of today, remember also the caution of the old seneschal, that one hunter should never get in another's way, and that two should never shoot at the same time at the same game. The seneschal was just pronouncing the word game, when the assessor whispered under his breath, "Dame." "Bravo!" cried the young men. There arose a murmur and laughter. All repeated Horeszkos's caution, especially the last word. Some cried "game," and others, laughing aloud, "Dame." The notary whispered "skirt," the assessor "flirt," fixing upon Telemina eyes like stilettos. The seneschal had not thought at all of making any personal allusions, and had not noticed what they were secretly whispering. Glad that he had been able to stir up laughter among the ladies and the young men, he turned to the hunters, wishing to cheer them up also, and he began anew, pouring himself out a glass of wine. In vain do my eyes seek the Bernardine. I should like to tell him a curious incident, similar to what occurred at our hunt today. The warden told us that he had known but one man who could shoot at long range with as good aim as Roback, but I knew another. By an equally sure shot he saved the lives of two men of high rank. I saw it myself, when Reitan, the deputy to the Diet, went hunting with the Prince de Nassau in the forests of Nalaboki. Those lords were not jealous of the fame of an untitled gentleman, but were the first to propose his health at table, and gave him countless splendid presents, and the hide of the boar that had been slain. Of that wild boar, and of the shot I will tell you as an eyewitness, for the incident was similar to that of today, and it happened to the greatest sportsman of my time, to the deputy Regtan and the Prince de Nassau. But then the judge spoke up, pouring out a beaker. "I drink the health of Roback. Seneschal, clink your glass with mine. If we cannot enrich the alms-gatherer with a gift, we will at least try to pay him for his powder. We promise solemnly that the bear killed this day in the wood shall suffice the cloister kitchen for 2 years. But the skin I will not give to the monk. I will either take it by force, or the monk must yield it to me through humility, or I will buy it, though it cost me the pelts of 10 sables. Of that skin we will dispose according to our will. The first crown and glory the servant of God has already received. The hide His Excellency the Chamberlain shall give to him who has deserved the second reward." The Chamberlain rubbed his forehead and lowered his eyebrows. The sportsmen began to murmur, and each made some remark. One how he had discovered the beast, another how he had wounded it. This one had called on the dogs, and that turned back the beast into the forest once more. The assessor and the notary disputed, one exalting the merits of his Sangusko gun, the other those of his Sagalas musket from Balabanovka. "Neighbor judge," pronounced the Chamberlain at last, "the servant of God has rightfully won the first reward. But it is not easy to decide who is the next to him, for all seem to me to have equal merits, all to be equal in skill, adroitness, and courage. Fortune, however, has this day distinguished 2 by the danger in which they were. 2 were nearest to the bear's claws, Thaddeus and the Count. To them the skin belongs. Thaddeus will yield, I am sure, as the younger, and as the kinsman of our host. Hence, your honor, the Count will receive the spolia opima. Let this trophy adorn your hunting chamber. Let it be a reminder of today's sport, a symbol of fortune in the chase, a spur to future glory." He concluded gaily, thinking that he had soothed the Count, and did not know how grievously he had stabbed his heart. For at the mention of his hunting chamber, the Count involuntarily raised his eyes, and those horns of stags, those branching antlers like a forest of laurels sown by the hands of the fathers to form crowns for the sons, those pillars adorned with rows of portraits, that coat of arms shining in the vaulting, the old half-goat, spoke to him from all sides with voices of the past. He awoke from his musings, and remembered where he was and whose guest. He, the heir of the Horeszkos, was a guest within his own threshold, was feasting with the Soplicas, his immemorial foes. And moreover, the jealousy that he felt for Thaddeus incensed the Count all the more powerfully against the Soplicas. So he said with a bitter laugh, "My little house is too small. In it there is no worthy place for so magnificent a gift. Let the bear rather abide amid these horned trophies until the judge deign to yield it to me together with the castle." The Chamberlain, guessing whither things were tending, tapped his golden snuff-box and asked for the floor. "You deserve praise, my neighbor Count," he said, "for caring for your interests even at dinner-time, not living thoughtlessly from day to day as do fashionable young fellows of your years. I wish and hope to end the trial in my Chamberlain's court by a reconciliation. Hitherto the only difficulty has been over the improvements. I have formed a project of exchange to make up for the improvements with land in the following fashion." Here he began to develop in due order, as he always did, a plan for the exchange that was to take place. He was already in the middle of the subject, when an unexpected movement started at the end of the table. Some were pointing at something that they had noticed, and others were looking in the same direction, until finally all heads, like ears of grain bent down by a wind behind them, were turned away from the Chamberlain to the corner. From the corner, where hung the portrait of the late Pantler, the last of the Horeszko family, from a little door concealed between the pillars, had quietly come forth a form like a phantom. It was Gerwazi. They recognized him by his stature, by his face, and by the little silvery half-goats on his yellow coat. He walked straight as a post, silent and grim, without taking off his hat, without even inclining his head. In his hand he held a glittering key, like a dagger. He opened a case and began to turn something in it. In 2 corners of the hall, against pillars, stood 2 musical clocks in locked cases. The queer old fellows, long at odds with the sun, often indicated noon at sunset. Gerwazi had not undertaken to repair the machines, but he would not give up winding them. He turned the key in the clocks every evening, and the time for winding had just come. While the chamberlain was occupying the attention of the parties interested in the case, he drew up the weight. The rusty wheels gnashed their broken teeth. The chamberlain shuddered and interrupted his dissertation. "Brother," he said, "postpone a bit your faithful toil," and he went on with his plan of an exchange. But the warden, to spite him, pulled still more strongly the other weight, and suddenly the bullfinch perched on the top of the clock began to flap its wings and pour forth one of its melodies. The bird, which had been artistically made, but was, unfortunately, out of order, began to moan and whistle, ever worse and worse. The guests burst out laughing. The chamberlain had to break off again. "My dear warden," he cried, "or rather screech owl if you value your beak, quit that hooting." But Gerwazi was not at all frightened by the threat. With dignity, he put his right hand on the clock and rested the left on his hip. With both hands thus supported, he cried, "My precious chamberlain, a grandee is free to make jokes. The sparrow is smaller than the owl, but on its own shavings it is bolder than the owl in a mansion not its own. A warden is no owl. Whoever comes by night into another man's loft is an owl, and I will scare him hence." "Put him out," shouted the chamberlain. "Count, you see what is being done," called the warden. "Is your honor not yet sufficiently tainted by eating and drinking with these Soplicas? In addition, must I, the keeper of the castle, Gerwazi Rembajlo, warden of the Horeszkos, be insulted in the house of my lords? And will you endure it?" Thereupon Protasi called out 3 times, "Silence! Clear the room! I, Protasi Baltazar Brzejalski, known under 2 titles, once general of the tribunal, commonly called apparitor, hereby make my apparitor's report and formal declaration, claiming as witnesses all freeborn persons here present, and summoning the assessor to investigate the case in behalf of his honor Judge Soplica, as to an incursion, that is to say, an infringement of the frontier, a violent entry of the castle, over which hitherto the judge has had legal authority, an evident proof of which is the fact that he is eating in the castle." "Windbag," yelled the warden, "I'll show you now." And taking from his belt his iron keys, he whirled them round his head and hurled them with all his might. The bunch of iron flew like a stone from a sling. It would surely have split Protasi's brow into quarters, but luckily the apparitor ducked and escaped death. All started from their places. For a moment there was a dead silence. Then the judge cried, "To the stocks with that bully! Ho, boys!" And the servants rushed nimbly along the narrow passage between the wall and the bench. But the count blocked their way with a chair, and, placing his foot firmly on that feeble entrenchment, called out, "Beware, judge! No one shall do injury to my servant in my own house. Whoever has a complaint against the old man, let him present it to me." The chamberlain cast a sidelong glance into the eyes of the count. "Without your valuable aid I shall manage to punish the insolent old fellow, but, your honor, the count is appropriating the castle ahead of time before the decree is pronounced. You are not lord here. You are not entertaining us. Sit quiet, as you have been sitting. If you honor not my gray head, at least respect the first office in the district." "What do I care?" muttered the count in return. "Enough of this prattle. Bore other men with your respects and offices. I have been guilty of folly enough already, when I joined with you gentlemen in drinking bouts that end by becoming coarse brawls. Give me satisfaction for the injury to my honor. We shall meet again when you are sober. Follow me, Gerwazi." The chamberlain had never expected any such answer as this, and was just filling his glass when he was smitten by the insolence of the count as by thunder. Resting the bottle motionless against the glass, he leaned his head to one side and pricked up his ears, opening wide his eyes and half unclosing his lips. He held his peace, but squeezed the glass in his hand so powerfully that it broke with a snap and sent the liquor spurting into his eyes. One would have said that with the wine fire was poured into his soul, so did his face flame, so did his eye blaze. He struggled to speak. The first word he ground indistinctly in his mouth until it flew forth between his teeth. "Fool, you cub of a count, I'll teach you. Thomas, my saber. I'll teach you Moors, you fool. Get to hell out of here. Respects and offices wound your delicate ears. I'll pay you up right off over your pretty earrings. Get out of the door, draw your sword. Thomas, my saber." Then friends rushed to the chamberlain, and the judge seized his hand. Hold, sir, this is our affair. I was challenged first. Protazi, my hanger, I will make him dance like a bear on a pole. But Thaddeus checked the judge. My dear uncle, and your honor the chamberlain, is it fitting for you gentlemen to meddle with this fop? Are there not young men here? And you, my brave youth, who challenge old men to combat, we shall see whether you are so terrible a knight. We will settle accounts tomorrow, and choose our place and weapons. Today depart, while you are still whole. The advice was good. The warden and the count had fallen into no common straits. At the upper end of the table only a mighty shouting was raging, but at the lower end bottles were flying around the head of the count. The frightened women began to beseech and weep. Telemina, with a cry of alas, lifted her eyes, rose, and fell in a faint, and inclining her neck over the count's shoulder, laid upon his breast her swan's breast. The count, infuriated though he was, checked himself in his mad career, and began to revive her and chafe her. Meanwhile Gerwazi, exposed to the blows of stools and bottles, was already tottering. Already the servants, doubling up their fists, were rushing on him from all sides in a crowd, when, fortunately, Zosia, seeing the assault, leapt up, and, filled with pity, sheltered the old man by extending her arms like a cross. They checked themselves. Gerwazi slowly retired and vanished from sight. They looked to see where he had hidden himself beneath the table, when suddenly he came out on the other side, as if from under the earth, and raising aloft a bench in his strong arms, whirled round like a windmill and cleared half the hall. He seized the count, and thus both, sheltered by the bench, retired towards the little door. When they were already almost at the threshold, Gerwazi stopped, once more eyed his foes, and deliberated for an instant, whether to retire under arms, or with new weapons to seek fortune in war. He chose the second. Already he had swung back the bench for a blow, like a battering ram. Already, with head bent down, breast thrust forward, and foot uplifted, he was about to attack, when he caught sight of the seneschal, and felt terror in his heart. The seneschal, sitting quietly, with half-closed eyes, had seemed buried in deep thought. Only when the count had bandied words with the chamberlain and threatened the judge, the seneschal had turned his head, had twice taken a pinch of snuff and rubbed his eyes. Although the seneschal was only a distant relative of the judge, yet he was established in his hospitable house, and was beyond measure careful about the health of his friend. Therefore he gazed with curiosity at the combat, and slowly extended on the table his arm, hand, and fingers. On his palm he laid a knife, with the haft extended to the tip of the index finger, and the point turned towards his elbow. Then with his arm extended a trifle backward, he poised it as if playing with it. But he watched the count. The art of throwing knives, terrible in hand-to-hand combat, had at that time already fallen into disuse in Lithuania, and was familiar only to old men. The warden had tried it often in tavern quarrels, and the seneschal was expert at it. From the motion of his arm one could see that he would hit hard, and from his eyes one could easily guess that he was aiming at the count, the last of the Horeszkos, although in the female line. The young men, less observant, did not understand the motions of the old seneschal, but Gerwazi turned pale, shielded the count with the bench, and withdrew towards the door. "Catch him!" shouted the crowd, as a wolf, when surprised over its carrion, throws itself blindly into the pack that disturbs its meal. He is already chasing them. He is about to tear them, when amid the yelping of the dogs a gun hammer gently clicks. The wolf recognizes it by the click, glances in that direction. He notices that in the rear, behind the hounds, a hunter, half crouching and upon one knee, is moving the gun barrel towards him, and is just touching the trigger. The wolf droops its ears and scuttles off with its tail between its legs. The pack with a triumphant uproar rush on and pluck it by its shaggy flanks. The beast often turns, glances at them, snaps its jaws, and hardly does he threaten them with the gnashing of his white teeth when the pack scamper away whining. So did Gerwazi withdraw with threatening mien, checking his assailants by his eyes and by the bench, until the count and he reached the back of the dark niche. "Catch him!" they cried again. The triumph was not long, for over the heads of the throng the warden appeared unexpectedly in the gallery by the old organ, and with a crash began to tear out the leaden pipes. He would have worked great havoc by his blows from above. But the guests were already leaving the hall in a throng. The terrified servants did not dare to hold their ground, but, seizing some of the platters, ran out after their masters. They left behind even the plates and a part of the service. Who last, caring not for the threats and blows, retired from the scene of battle? Protazy Brachalski. He, standing unmoved behind the judge's chair, in his apparator's voice, recited his notification until he had reached the very end. Then he abandoned the empty battlefield, where remained corpses, wounded, and ruins. Among the men there were no casualties, but all the benches had legs dislocated, and the table was also crippled. Stripped of its cloth, it lay upon plates dripping with wine, like a knight upon bloody shields, among numerous bodies of chickens and turkeys, from which protruded the forks lately stuck within their breasts. In a moment, all within the deserted building of the Horeszkos had returned to its wonted calm. The darkness thickened. The remnants of the magnificent feast lay like that nocturnal banquet to which the ghosts of the departed must gather when evoked at the festival of the forefathers. Now the owls had cried thrice from the garret like conjurers. They seemed to greet the rising of the moon, of which the form fell through the window on the table, trembling like a spirit in purgatory. From the vaults beneath, rats leapt out through holes like the souls of the damned. They gnawed and drank. At times, in a corner, a forgotten champagne bottle would pop as a toast to the spirits. But on the second story, in the room that was still called the mirror room, though the mirrors were gone, stood the Count on the balcony facing the gate. He was cooling himself in the breeze. He had put his long coat on only one arm, folding the other sleeve and the skirts about his neck and draping his breast with the coat as with a cloak. Gerwazy was walking with long steps through the apartment. Both were deep in thought and were talking together. "Pistols," said the Count, "or, if they prefer, sabers." "The castle," said the warden, "and the village, both are ours." "Challenge the uncle, the nephew," exclaimed the Count, "the whole family." "Seize the castle," exclaimed the warden, "the village and the lands." As he said this, he turned to the Count. "If you wish to have peace, take possession of the whole. Of what use is the lawsuit, my boy? The affair is plain as day. The castle has been in the hands of the Horeszkos for 400 years. A part of the estate was torn from it in the time of the Targowica Confederacy, and, as you know, given into the possession of the Soplica. You ought to take from them not only that part, but the whole, for the costs of the suit, and as punishment for their plundering. I have always said to you, let lawsuits alone. I have always said to you, raid them, make a foray on them. That was the ancient custom. Whoever once possessed an estate was the heir thereof. Win in the field, and you will win in the court too. As for our ancient quarrels with the Soplicas, for them I have a little penknife that is better than a lawsuit, and if Massier gives me the aid of his switch, then we two together will chop those Soplicas into fodder." "Bravo," said the Count. "Your plan, of Gothico-Sarmatian stamp, pleases me better than the wrangling of advocates. See here, through all Lithuania we will make a stir by an expedition such as has not been heard of for many a long day, and we shall enjoy it ourselves. For 2 years have I been abiding here, and what fighting have I ever seen, with boars over a boundary line? Our expedition, however, promises bloodshed. In one such I took part during my travels. When I tarried in Sicily with a certain prince, brigands bore away his son-in-law into the mountains and insolently demanded a ransom from his kinsfolk. We, hastily gathering our servants and vassals, attacked them. I killed 2 robbers with mine own hand. I was the first to break into their camp. I freed the prisoner. Ah, my Gerwazy, how triumphant, how beautiful was our return, in knightly feudal style. The populace met us with flowers. The daughter of the prince, grateful to the deliverer, with tears fell into my embraces. When I arrived at Palermo, they knew of it from the Gazette, and all the women pointed at me. They even printed a romance about the whole event, where I am mentioned by name. The romance is entitled The Count, or The Mysteries of the Castle of Burbante Rocca. Are there dungeons in this castle? There are immense beer cellars, said the warden, but empty, for the Soplicas have drunk up the wine. We must arm the jockeys on the estate, added the Count, and summon the vassals from the village. Lackeys? God forbid, interrupted Gerwazy. Is a foray a drunk and disorderly affair? Who ever heard of making a foray with boors and lackeys? Sir, you know nothing at all about forays. Vassals, that is, mustachioed champions, are something quite different. Vassals of that sort can be found. But we must not look for them in the peasant villages, but through the hamlets of the gentry, in Dobrzyn, in Jezikov, in Chientich, in Rombanki. The gentry of ancient lineage, in whom flows knightly blood, are all well disposed to the family of the Horeszkos, and are all mortal enemies of the Soplicas. Thence I will collect some 300 mustachioed gentlemen. That is my affair. Do you return to your mansion and sleep your fill, for tomorrow there will be hard work. You are fond of sleeping. It is already late. The second cock is already crowing. I will guard the castle here until day breaks, and at sunrise I shall be in the hamlet of Dobrzyn. At these words the Count withdrew from the balcony, but before he departed he glanced through the opening of an embrasure and exclaimed, seeing a multitude of lights in the household of the Soplicas, "Illuminate if you will. Tomorrow at this time it will be bright in this castle, but dark in your mansion." Gerwazi sat down upon the floor, leaned against the wall, and bent down his thought-laden brow towards his breast. The light of the moon fell on his bald pate, and Gerwazi drew upon it various patterns with his finger. It was evident that he was spinning warlike plans for future expeditions. His heavy lids were more and more weighed down. His head nodded on his powerless neck. He felt that sleep was overcoming him, and began according to his wont his evening prayers. But between the Paternoster and the Ave Maria arose strange phantoms, wavering and jostling each other. The warden sees the Horeszkos, his ancient lords. Some carry sabers and others maces. Each gazes menacingly and twirls his mustache, flourishing his saber or brandishing his mace. After them flashed one silent, gloomy shadow, with a bloody spot upon its breast. Gerwazi shuddered. He had recognized the Pantler. He began to cross himself, and, the more surely to drive away his terrible visions, he recited the litany for souls in purgatory. Again his eyes closed fast and his ears rang. He sees a throng of mounted gentry. Their sabers glitter. The foray against Korolice and Rimza at the head. And he beholds himself, how he flies on a grey horse, with his dreadful sword uplifted above his head. His tarataka opened wide, rustles in the breeze. His red-plumed hat has fallen backward from his left ear. He flies on, and upon the road overthrows both horsemen and foot travelers, and finally he burns the Soplica in his barn. Then his head, heavy with its musings, drooped upon his breast, and thus fell asleep the last warden of the Horeszkos.
Remember to subscribe.